Welcome to the Pirate Therapist podcast, where we dig past the headlines, question the assumptions, and explore the real stories behind the topics that shape our lives. Today, we're talking about Tourette syndrome, what it actually is, what it is not, and why understanding it matters so much. I'm your host, Lee Perry, and I am the Pirate Therapist. Now, most people think that Tourette syndrome is just about involuntary swearing, but that is one of the biggest misconceptions about it. Tourette's is a neurological condition that involves tics, which is a sudden, repetitive movements or sounds that a person cannot easily control. These tics can include blinking, facial movements, shoulder shrugging, throat clearing, grunting, or in some cases, repeating words or phrases. Now, Tourette's usually begins in childhood between the ages of 2 and 15, with the average onset around age 6. Now, it's more common in boys than in girls, and the symptoms often change over time, sometimes becoming less intense in the teen years or in adulthood. Stress, fatigue, excitement, illness, these things can make tics worse, while focused or calming activities can sometimes make them less noticeable. Now, what makes Tourette's especially challenging is that the tics are often only part of the picture. Many people with Tourette's also live with ADHD, OCD, anxiety, depression. They have learning difficulties, which can affect schoolwork and relationship and jobs, and it most definitely can hit them in the self esteem. Now, the condition is not caused by bad parenting or lack of discipline or poor character. It's a complex neurodevelopmental disorder, likely shaped by a mix of genetic and environmental factors. There is no single cure for Tourette's, but there are effective ways to manage it. Some people don't need treatment at all if the symptoms are mild, while others benefit from behavioral therapy like CBIT, which helps them to recognize tics early and use a competing response. Medication can also help in some cases, especially when tics are interfering with daily life. The important thing to remember is that Tourette's does not define a person. And with that understanding and support, many people with Tourette's lead full, successful lives. So let's dig a little deeper. What Tourette's is. Tourette's syndrome is a neurological condition that causes a person to have tics, sudden repetitive movements or sounds that are difficult to control. These tics can be motor tics, blinking, facial movement, shoulder shrugging, like we said, head jerking, vocal tics, throat clearing, sniffing, humming. It's a good sized list. For some people, the tics are mild and only happen occasionally. For others, they're more frequent, more noticeable, and they can affect their daily life in a much bigger way. Now, one of the more important things to understand is that Tourette's is not a choice. It's not a habit, nor is it a sign that someone is just trying to get attention. The tics happen involuntarily, even when the person may be aware of them or feel them building up beforehand. And that's part of what makes Tourette's so frustrating for the people who live with it. They often know exactly what's happening, but that doesn't mean that they can just not do it. They just can't stop it. Tourette's usually begins in childhood, and its symptoms can change over time. Tics may come and go, shift in the type of tic, or become more or less intense, depending on stress, fatigue, excitement, or other factors. So when people picture Tourette's as one fixed set of symptoms, they're kind of missing a bigger truth here. It's a condition that can look very different from one person to the next, and even from one stage of life to another. One of the most helpful ways to understand Tourette's is to break tics into different types. The two main categories are motor tics and vocal tics. Motor tics are movements, while vocal tics are sounds. Both can be simple or complex, and both can vary a lot from person to person. Simple motor tics are quick, small movements like blinking, eye rolling, nose twitching, facial grimacing, shrugging the shoulders, or head jerking. Complex motor tics involve more coordinated pattern of movement, such as touching objects, jumping, bending down, or repeating a specific gesture. These movements can sometimes look intentional to an outside observer, even though they are not. Simple vocal tics are noises rather than words. These might include throat clearing, sniffing, coughing, grunting, humming, clicking. Again, it's a fairly good list, good size list. Complex vocal tics can include repeating words, phrases, sometimes even repeating full sentences. And this is where the popularly accepted image of Tourette's comes from. But it's important to remember that not everyone with Tourette's has vocal tics, and not everyone has the same kind. Tics can shift over time. A person might start with eye blinking, then later develop shoulder movements or vocal tics. Some tics fade while others will appear, and symptoms often rise and fall in cycles. That that changing pattern is one reason Tourette's can be really hard to understand from the outside. It doesn't always look the same from day to day or even hour to hour. Now, Tourette's syndrome usually begins in childhood, and in many cases, the earliest signs are easy to miss or even dismiss. A child might start blinking more often, clearing their throat repeatedly, scrunching their face or shrugging their shoulders, making small movements that are maybe not noticeable or just considered harmless at first. Now, because these tics can be subtle, parents, teachers, and oftentimes even doctors may not immediately recognize them as part of a neurological condition. They might assume the child is nervous or distracted. Maybe they're just developing a habit or going through a temporary phase. Now, that's part of what makes early Tourette's so complicated. The first signs are often small enough to be easily overlooked, but frequent enough to become noticeable once you know what to look for. A child may appear perfectly fine one moment and then suddenly begin repeating a movement or a sound in a way that seems strange or unexplained. Some children also feel an internal urge before the tic happens, almost like a pressure building up inside them that is only relived once the tic is performed. Now, they may not have the words to describe this feeling, which can make the whole experience even more confusing. Tourette's often emerges gradually rather than all at once. The first tic may appear in one area of the body and then shift over time to another. Or a child who starts with blinking their eyes might develop later facial tic or shoulder movements, or switch over to vocal tics. This changing pattern can make it hard for families to connect the dots, especially because the tics tend to wax and wane. Now, there may be some days or weeks where symptoms seem to just entirely disappear, only to return later. Sometimes more noticeably than before, that inconsistency can lead people to think that the child is exaggerating or faking. And maybe they're doing it intentionally just for attention, when in reality, the condition is fluctuating in a very real way for them. The childhood onset of Tourette's also matters because this is often the stage where a child is most vulnerable to misunderstanding. Kids are learning how to fit in, how to manage their attention from others, and how to make sense of their own bodies. If they begin having tics in school, they might get teased or corrected or singled out before anyone understands what's actually going on. Some children become very aware of being watched and start trying to hide their tics, which can be exhausting and incredibly stressful. That pressure can make the tics feel even more intense, creating a difficult cycle of self consciousness and suppression. For families, the early years can be a time of uncertainty. They may visit doctors and search for answers, trying to figure out whether the behavior is temporary or worry that something is being missed. In some cases, a child might also have symptoms of ADHD, OCD, anxiety, or other conditions that appear alongside Tourette's, which can further complicate the picture. The result is that early Tourette's is often not just a medical story, but it's an emotional one too. One filled with confusion, frustration, concern, and their never ending search for clarity. What's important to remember is that childhood onset does not mean the child is doomed to struggle forever. For many people, symptoms change significantly as they grow older, and some tics become less disruptive with time. But getting a clear understanding early on can make a major difference. It can replace shame with knowledge, fear, and support. and confusion with a sense of direction. Now, for a child who feels like something about them is different, but they don't know how to explain why, that understanding can be life changing. Let's explore some myths and misconceptions about Tourette's. One of the hardest parts of living with Tourette's is not always the tics themselves, but the way that other people react to them. Over time, Tourette's has been surrounded by myths, jokes, and oversimplified ideas that make it harder for people to understand what the condition actually is. The most common misconception is that Tourette's always means swearing or shouting out random words. Well, in reality, that kind of symptom exists for some people, but it's far from the whole picture. And for many people with Tourette's, it never happens at all. Another major myth is that people with Tourette's can simply stop their tics if they just try hard enough. Now, that assumption misses the entire nature of the condition. Tics are not intentional, and while some people may be able to suppress them temporarily, that usually takes a great deal of effort and can become uncomfortable or exhausting. Now, imagine having to hold back an urge that builds and builds inside of your body, all the while trying to focus on schoolwork or your job or perhaps even just a conversation. Suppression may look like control from the outside, but to the person experiencing it, it can feel like a pressure, a mental strain, if you will. There's also a harmful idea that Tourette's is somehow linked to intelligence, behavior, or personality in a very simplistic way. People may assume that someone with Tourette's is acting out. Maybe they're choosing to be rude or choosing to just be disruptive. Others may treat the condition like a punchline, which can make everyday life feel humiliating and isolating. These reactions can be especially damaging for children and teenagers who may already be trying to figure out how to fit in. Instead of being seen as a person dealing with a neurological condition, they're often seen as an oddity or a joke or a problem that has to be managed. The truth is that Tourette's is neither a character flaw nor a performance. It's a neurological condition that affects each person differently. And the stereotypes around it often create more harm than the tics themselves. When people only know the exaggerated version from movies and television or on social media, they're missing the reality that most people with Tourette's are simply just trying to live their lives, manage their symptoms, and to be understood just like anyone else. That's why breaking down these myths is important. Real understanding starts when the caricature ends. Now, some of the common myths that people believe, one of the biggest challenges for people with Tourette's is that the condition is often shaped more by the public myth than by any real understanding. Long before someone meets a person with Tourette's, they may already think they know what it is from a joke or from a movie or some viral clip. Maybe they've just heard things secondhand. The problem is that these images are usually exaggerated, incomplete, or oftentimes just straight up wrong. And once a myth becomes familiar, it can be surprisingly hard to replace it with some kind of truth. The most common myth is that Tourette's always involves swearing. This is probably because it's the stereotype that most people recognize, but it is also one of the most misleading. Some people with Tourette's do have vocal tics, which involve the words and the phrases. In some cases, those can include socially inappropriate or offensive language. But that's not the defining feature of the condition, and it's not something that happens to everyone. In fact, many people with Tourette's never experience this kind of tic at all. Reducing the entire condition to swearing is like reducing heart conditions to chest pain. It's a tiny piece of a much bigger picture. Another myth is that the person is doing it on purpose, or they can stop if they just really wanted to. This one is one of the more damaging assumptions because it turns a neurological condition into a moral judgment. From the outside, a tic can look like a choice, especially if it's a repetitive or unusual. But looking voluntary and being voluntary are not the same thing. People with Tourette's may sometimes suppress tics for a short time, but that usually takes intense focus and can leave them feeling stressed, distracted, and overwhelmed. The fact that Someone can sometimes hold something back does not mean that they are controlling it in the way that other people might imagine. There's also a myth that Tourette's is rare in the way that people think of rare conditions. It's something exotic or dramatic or immediately obvious. In reality, Tourette's exists on a spectrum, and many cases are mild, they're very subtle, and they're hidden from view. Some people have tics that are very noticeable, while others have ones that are easy to miss unless you spend time with them regularly. Because of that, people often misread it entirely. They might not recognize a tic as a tic, or they may assume that the person is nervous, clumsy, fidgety, just acting weird. That invisibility can make a diagnosis and understanding much harder. A related myth is that Tourette's is always severe and disruptive. This idea comes from the way the condition is often portrayed in the media, where the most extreme and sensational examples get the most attention. But many people live with tics that are manageable most of the time, even if they're still frustrating or embarrassing. Others have periods where symptoms are more intense and periods where they're quieter. Tourette's doesn't always look dramatic. And for that reason, people who live with it may not always be believed or taken seriously. The condition can be very real when it's not even visually obvious. People also tend to assume that Tourette's is just about the tics, when in reality, surrounding experience can be much more complicated. A person may also be dealing with ADHD and OCD, anxiety, depression, sensory issues, social stress. All of these are factors that can shape daily life as much as the tics themselves. If someone is distracted, anxious, or emotionally worn down, their symptoms may become more noticeable. That can lead others to assume that the tics are caused by stress alone, or that they're merely a reaction to mood. Stress can influence symptoms, but it doesn't always explain away the condition. There's even a myth that people with Tourette's are somehow less capable, maybe less intelligent, or less put together because of their tics. Now, that assumption can be subtle, but it shows up in the way that people speak to someone, overlook their abilities, or treat them like they're fragile or unpredictable. In reality, Tourette's is nothing about a person's intelligence, creativity, responsibility, or potential. People with Tourette's can be teachers, artists, students, parents, workers, athletes, leaders. The condition is one part of a person's life, not the full definition of who they are. And the last myth worth addressing is the idea that everyone experiences Tourette's in the same way. This is one of the reasons that public understanding stays so shallow. People want a single, neat definition, but Tourette's does not fit that kind of box. Tics can shift over time. They can be mild or intense, simple or complex, visible or very subtle. The emotional impact can range from barely noticeable to deeply disruptive. And because every person's experience is different, one person's story should never be treated as the entirety of the truth. Breaking down these myths matters because stigma grows in the space between what people assume and what they actually understand. When someone with Tourette's is reduced to a stereotype, they lose the chance to be seen as a whole person. And when the public learns only the exaggerated version, it becomes harder for real people to be heard, to be believed, and to be supported. The more accurate picture is much more human. Tourette's isn't a joke, it's not a gimmick, and it's not a personality trait. It is a neurological condition that deserves understanding, patience, and respect. You ever wondered what it's like to live with Tourette's? Now, I don't know this personally, but we're going to give it a go based on my experiences and what I've seen. So, living with Tourette's is often less about the tics themselves and more about everything that comes with them. For the person experiencing it, a tic can be physically uncomfortable, distracting, embarrassing, often because of the efforts put into muffling those. It can be exhausting, especially when it happens in public or at a time when they're trying really hard to concentrate. A small movement or sound that lasts only a second can still have a big emotional impact because it may happen again and again throughout the day. with no warning and no easy way to stop it. Many people with Tourette's describe a kind of buildup before a tic happens. It's kind of like a pressure, an itch, an urge inside the body that needs to be released, some kind of compulsion. That feeling can make the condition especially frustrating because the person is not simply reacting after the fact. They're often aware of something coming and they're still unable to control it. Some tics may bring brief relief, while others may be unwanted, disruptive, or upsetting. Either way, the experience can leave a person feeling like their body is sometimes moving or speaking before they're ready. The social side of Tourette's can be just as difficult as the physical side. People may stare, laugh, ask invasive questions, or assume the person is being rude or dramatic or just intentionally disruptive. Now, that kind of attention can make ordinary situations feel stressful, especially at school, on the job, when you're shopping, when you're surrounded by strangers. Over time, a person may start trying to hide their tics, suppress them, or avoid situations where they feel like they're being stared at. But hiding symptoms usually takes a lot of energy, and that effort can make that day feel even more draining. So, for children and teenagers, this can be really painful. Kids want to blend in, they want to make friends, and they want to avoid standing out in ways that they can't control. When Tourette's makes them noticeable, it can lead to teasing, misunderstanding, and oftentimes isolation. Some children become hyper aware of their tics and start to feel anxious about it and when the next one's going to happen. That anxiety can create a tough cycle because the more stressed or self conscious they feel, the harder the whole experience can become. There's also an emotional weight that doesn't always get talked about. People with Tourette's may feel frustration, shame, anger, sadness, or grief over the ways the condition affects their life. They may feel misunderstood even by people who care about them, because unless you live with it yourself, it can be really hard to fully grasp how relentless it can feel. At the same time, many people with Tourette's also develop resilience, humor, and self awareness as they learn to navigate the world that doesn't always know how to respond to them. They often become experts at reading people, managing stress, and pushing through discomfort in ways that others just don't have to see. What's important to remember is that Tourette's is not the whole person's identity, even if it affects a lot of their daily experience. Someone with Tourette's is still a friend, a sibling, a student, a parent, an artist, a worker, a dreamer, someone who has goals and talents and a life much bigger than their tics. The condition may shape how they move through the world, but it doesn't define their worth. And for many people, being understood with kindness makes an enormous difference in how manageable that life feels. One of the most important things to understand about Tourette's is that it often does not appear alone. For many people, Tourette's is only one part of a broader neurological and emotional picture. Conditions like ADHD, OCD, anxiety, depression. Yeah, I made this list before. And learning differences are commonly seen alongside it. And those overlapping challenges can shape a person's daily life just as much as the tics themselves. And that means someone may be dealing not only with involuntary movements or sounds, but also with attention struggles, intrusive thoughts, emotional overwhelm, or difficulty managing stress. This overlap can make Tourette's harder to recognize and more complicated to explain. For example, a child might be called hyperactive because of the ADHD, perfectionistic because of the OCD, or anxious because they seem tense in social situations, when in reality, those patterns may all be connected in some way to a larger neurodevelopmental profile. A person with Tourette's may also have obsessive urges, ritualized behaviors, or intense mental discomfort that have nothing to do with the tics themselves. Because of that, it's often a mistake to look at Tourette's as if it exists in a vacuum. The emotional impact of these co occurring conditions can be significant. A person may already be working hard to manage tics and then also have to handle a distractibility or intrusive thoughts. Fear of judgment, sleep problems, or difficulty regulating emotions. That can make schoolwork, jobs, relationships be more exhausting than they would be otherwise. It can also lead to misunderstandings because the visible tics may draw attention while the quieter struggles still remain hidden. Someone may seem fine on the outside while fighting a very intense internal battle. For families, this can be a confusing part of the journey. A child might be diagnosed with one condition and then later another, or the full picture might only become clear over time. And that can make it harder to know what support is needed and which behaviors are symptoms versus personality traits, coping strategies, or stress responses. The understanding the overlap is crucial because treating Tourette's effectively often means seeing the whole person and not just the tics. Now, the good news is that the broader picture can also point towards better support. When caregivers, teachers, doctors, and friends understand that Tourette's may come with other conditions, they can respond with more patience and flexibility. Instead of asking, why is this person acting this way? The better question becomes, what is this person dealing with? And how can we make things easier? That shift can reduce shame and open the door to real help. In many cases, the most powerful support starts with simply recognizing that Tourette's is part of a larger story. It is not the entire story. One of the most confusing things about Tourette's for people on the outside is that the symptoms can seem unpredictable. A tic may be present one day and barely noticeable the next, and then suddenly much more active at some other time. This shifting pattern is part of what makes Tourette's so difficult to explain because it doesn't behave in a neat, consistent way. It can appear to come and go, but that doesn't mean it's fake, exaggerated, or under the person's conscious control in any way. Stress is one of the most common things that can make tics more noticeable, but it's not the only factor. Fatigue, excitement, illness, changes in routine, anxiety, and even being too aware of the tics can all affect how intense they seem. A child might hold things together all day at school and then have more noticeable tics at home, or a person might seem calm in one setting but struggle more in another. That inconsistency can confuse people who expect symptoms to look the same all the time, but Tourette's doesn't usually work that way. There's also an important pattern known as waxing and waning, which means symptoms can rise and fall in intensity over time. Some periods are quieter, while others can feel much more disruptive. A person may also notice that one tic fades while another one appears, or that the type of tic changes as they get older. This can make it feel like Tourette's is constantly changing shape, which in a way it is. The condition is not a fixed script. It's a moving experience that can shift across weeks, months, and years. For the person living with it, this unpredictability can be frustrating because it creates a sense of uncertainty. They may never know exactly when a tic will happen or how noticeable it will be in a given moment. That can make school presentations, job interviews, hanging out with your friends, or just quiet public spaces feel stressful in ways others might not understand. Some people start anticipating the tics so much that the worry itself becomes part of that burden. It's not just the movement or the sound, it's the constant awareness that it could happen at any time. Now, understanding triggers doesn't mean blaming the person for causing their own symptoms. It means recognizing that the nervous system is responsive to stress, environment, and the body state in ways that are often outside of conscious control. Now, that distinction matters because people with Tourette's are already dealing with enough without being told to just relax, calm down, or try harder. The more helpful approach is to create conditions that reduce pressure where possible and to respond with patience when symptoms shift. Tourette's is not static, and once people accept that, they begin to understand the condition much more accurately. The diagnosing Tourette's can be more complicated than people often assume. because there isn't a single lab test or a scan that can confirm it. Instead, diagnosis usually depends on observing the pattern of tics over time, the age when they began, and whether the symptoms fit a broader picture of a tic disorder. That means the process is often less like finding one clear answer and more like putting together several clues. For families, that can be really frustrating, especially when they already know something is happening, but they don't have a name to put on it yet. One reason diagnosis can take time is that Tourette's often starts very subtly. Early tics may be small enough to dismiss as nervous habits, fidgeting, or some kind of temporary childhood behavior. A child might blink, shrug, sniff, or clear their throat, or just make small movements that come and go before anyone realizes that there is a pattern. Because tics can wax and wane, a doctor may not always see the full picture in a single appointment, and that can make early recognition harder than it should be. Another challenge is that Tourette's is often misunderstood by the people around the child long before it's formally recognized. Parents may be told the behavior is just a phase. Teachers might think the child is distracted or acting out. The child themselves may not know how to describe what they are feeling, especially if the tics are preceded by a sensation that's hard to put into words. By the time the condition is identified, there may already have been months or years of confusion, worry, and incorrect assumptions. Recognition matters because it can completely change the emotional tone of the experience. Before diagnosis, a child may feel like something is wrong with them, but not know what. After diagnosis, there's often relief in having a name for it, even if the condition itself is still frustrating. Now, understanding that the tics are part of a neurological condition can reduce shame and help parents and teachers and friends respond more appropriately. It can also prevent the child from internalizing blame for something that they never chose. Diagnosis also matters because it opens the door for support. Once Tourette's is recognized, families can better understand what kinds of help might be useful, whether that means in school accommodation, behavioral therapy, or support for co occurring conditions. Now, just as importantly, diagnosis can help separate the condition from the person's identity. Instead of being seen as the kid who is always doing that, they can be seen as a child who has Tourette's and needs understanding, not punishment. And that distinction is huge. Recognition doesn't magically erase the tics, but it can replace confusion with context and shame with compassion. And for many people, that's the moment that the condition becomes less mysterious and far more manageable. One of the most reassuring things about Tourette's is that there are ways to manage it. Even though there is no single cure, treatment is not always necessary for every person, especially if the tics are mild and they don't interfere much with daily life. But when the symptoms become painful, disruptive, emotionally draining, support can make a big difference. The goal is not to erase the person or to force every tic away, but to help them function more comfortably and confidently. For many people, behavioral therapy is one of the most useful approaches. A common example is habit reversal, or CBIT, which helps a person to become more aware of the early signs of a tic and practice a different response. The idea is not the shame of the tic or pretend it's a bad habit, or to give them more tools and more control over how they respond to these urges. And that can be empowering, especially for people who have spent a long time feeling like their body is working against them. Medication can also play a role in some cases, particularly when tics are severe or when co occurring conditions like ADHD, OCD, or anxiety and depression, when these are making life harder. Different people respond differently to treatment, and what helps one person may not be right for another. That's why management often has to be individualized. Tourette's is not a one size fits all condition, and neither is the treatment plan. Support in everyday life matters just as much as a formal treatment. A child may need understanding from teachers who do not punish tics or draw unnecessary attention to them. An adult may need flexibility at work or just extra patience from their friends. Or maybe they just need a space where they don't feel like they're being watched every second. The more relaxed and accepting the environment, the less pressure that person may feel. And that can sometimes make symptoms easier to cope with. Even simple things like not making a big deal out of a tick can help more often than people realize. It's also important to remember that management can change over time. What a person needs at age 8 may be very different from what they need as a teenager or an adult. Some people find that tics become less intense as they get older, while others continue to manage them throughout their life. Either way, the presence of Tourette's does not mean someone cannot thrive. It simply means they may need a little more support, a little more understanding, and some flexibility along the way. At its best, treatment is not about fixing a broken person. It's about reducing suffering, improving daily life, and giving someone the space to be themselves without constantly struggling. That's a very different mindset from the one where people often bring to Tourette's at first glance. Living with Tourette's does not happen in a vacuum. It follows a person into classrooms, offices, friendships, family functions, and every other space where they are expected to function, connect, and be understood. That means that the condition is not just medical experience, it's a social one. For many people, the hardest part is not only managing the tics themselves, but managing how other people respond to them. Now, in school, Tourette's can be Tourette's can become especially difficult because children are constantly being observed, corrected, and compared. A student who blinks, shifts, or clears their throat or makes small noises can be seen as distracting, disruptive, or inattentive when they're actually dealing with tics that they can't control. If teachers don't understand what's happening, the child might be punished, embarrassed, or singled out in ways that make school feel unsafe. Even when the tics are mild, the fear of being noticed can make that school day feel so much heavier to the person with Tourette's, way heavier than it should. Work can present a different kind of challenge. Adults with Tourette's may worry about how coworkers, supervisors, perhaps their clients will react if their tics become noticeable. Some people try and hide their symptoms for as long as possible, which can be mentally exhausting and emotionally isolating. Others may need accommodations, flexibility, or perhaps an environment where they're not judged for something that's outside of their control. The pressure to appear polished, calm, and perfectly consistent can make the workplace feel especially stressful, even when the person is highly capable and fully qualified. Relationships can also be deeply affected by misunderstanding, though they can also be one of the biggest sources of support. Friends and family who take the time to learn about Tourette's can make a huge difference just by responding with patience instead of alarm. On the other hand, if a person is constantly teased, corrected, or treated like a problem that needs to be managed, that can create distance and hurt. Many people with Tourette's become very careful about who they trust because it takes a certain kind of person to see beyond the tic and understand the human being underneath it. There's also an emotional burden of wanting to be accepted without having to explain yourself all the time. A person with Tourette's may spend a lot of energy deciding when to mention their condition, when to ignore a reaction, and when to advocate for themselves. That constant self monitoring is also exhausting. And yet, when people around them respond with understanding, the experience for them can change dramatically. The difference between being stared at and being supported can shape how safe someone feels in their own life. What makes this issue so important is that Tourette's doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the spaces that they move through. Whether it's school, job, or friend groups, they can either add stress or they can help lighten it. And often, the most meaningful support is not complicated at all. It's as simple as not making a joke or not assuming the worst and just treating the person like anyone else who deserves dignity and respect. One of the biggest reasons that people misunderstand Tourette's is the way it's been portrayed in movies and television, in online culture. Now, far too often, the condition is used as a quick joke or a shocking twist or to make a character seem unpredictable and awkward. That kind of betrayal might get a laugh or create a memorable scene, but it also leaves behind a distorted image of what Tourette's actually looks like in real life. Instead of helping people understand the condition, it turns that condition into a punchline. The problem with media stereotypes is that they're powerful. For many people, the first time they hear about Tourette's is not from a doctor or a teacher or someone who actually has Tourette's. It's from a joke, a scene in a movie, or a viral clip that just highlights the most extreme and unusual versions of the condition. Once that image takes hold, it can shape how people react in real life. They may expect swearing, dramatic outbursts, or constant visible movement. And when that's not what they see, they may become confused or dismissive. In other words, the stereotype becomes the standard, and real people are measured against it. That can be really frustrating for people with Tourette's, especially because media depictions often leave out the quieter, more ordinary parts of life. They don't usually show the exhaustion of suppressing tics all day, or the embarrassment of being stared at, or the stress of trying to focus in class, or the emotional toll of being constantly misunderstood. They also rarely show the full person behind the condition, their humor, their interests, their intellect, their relationships, and their individuality. Instead, the person becomes a symbol of the condition, as if Tourette's is the only thing worth noticing. There's also a subtle harm in how often Tourette's is used as a shorthand for chaos or lack of control. That framing can make people see the condition as something bizarre rather than something human. It can make children with Tourette's feel like they're performing a role that they never wanted, and that it can make adults feel as if they have to constantly correct the public's assumptions just to be taken seriously. Now, over time, that pressure is draining because it forces people to defend their own reality against a caricature that was never accurate in the first place. Now, good news is that media can do better. When Tourette's is portrayed with accuracy, it becomes easier for audiences to understand the condition is varied, personal, and far more nuanced than a stereotype might suggest. A thoughtful portrayal does not need to erase the difficulty of living with tics, but it should treat the person with dignity. And that means showing the condition as one part of a larger life, not the entire story. It means replacing cheap laughs with real context and replacing shock value with empathy. And that matters because for many people, media is where understanding begins. If the first image is misleading, the work of correcting it becomes a lot harder. When people but when the story is told with care, it can help people look past the stereotype and see the person who's been there all along. Even with all the challenges that Tourette's can bring, it's important not to lose sight of the resilience that so many people develop while living with it. Tourette's can be exhausting, unpredictable, and frustrating, but it does not erase that person's ability to grow, succeed, connect, and build a meaningful life. In fact, many people with Tourette's become especially strong in ways that are easy to overlook from the outside. They learn how to adapt, how to cope under pressure, and how to keep going in situations where other people might not realize just how much effort is required. A big part of that resilience comes from learning to navigate misunderstanding. People with Tourette's often spend years figuring out how to explain themselves, how to advocate for their needs, and how to handle reactions from others without letting those reactions define them. That kind of emotional endurance can shape a person in very powerful ways. It can build empathy, self awareness, humor, and a deep appreciation for the people who respond with kindness instead of judgment. Hope also comes from the fact that Tourette's can change over time. For many people, the intensity of symptoms shifts as they move throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Some find that tics become less disruptive later in life, while others learn better strategies for how to manage them. Even when symptoms remain, the person often becomes more familiar with their own patterns, their triggers, and their needs. And that understanding can make the condition feel less overwhelming and more manageable, even if it never disappears entirely. It's also worth remembering that people with Tourette's are much more than their symptoms. They're artists, they're athletes, they're students, parents, professionals, friends, leaders. They have talents, they have goals, preferences, and dreams that exist completely outside of the Tourette's. And when they're given support and respect and a chance to be seen as whole people, they're fully capable of thriving. The presence of Tourette's may change how they move through the world, but it doesn't limit the fullness of who they can become. And that is really where the hope in this story lives. Not in pretending Tourette's is easy and not in pretending that it's the same for everyone, but in recognizing that a diagnosis is never the end of the story. For a lot of people, it's a beginning of understanding, support, and self acceptance. It's the moment when confusion starts turning into clarity and shame starts giving way to compassion. That shift, if we can manage that, can change everything. I want to talk about a specific person here that I've seen numerous times on social media, and I'm hoping I'm not screwing up her name. Rachel Chalif, or as I think she introduces herself most of the time, Rachel Orkey. And she's become an important voice in Tourette's awareness because she does more than just talk about her diagnosis. She helps people actually understand what it feels like to live with it. Through her videos and public storytelling, she gives viewers a glimpse into the day to day reality of Tourette's in a way that is honest, personal, and impossible to reduce to a stereotype. Instead of presenting Tourette's as a strange or sensational condition, she shows it as a part of a full human life, one that includes frustration, vulnerability, humor, resilience, courage. And what makes her work so powerful is that she helps educate people through a lived experience. She doesn't just explain the facts of Tourette's, she shows the emotional side of it too. She helps people see what it means to move through the world while dealing with tics, public reactions, and the constant pressure of being misunderstood. That kind of education matters because it's so many people only know Tourette's from jokes and misinformation and exaggerated portrayals. By speaking openly, she replaces those assumptions with something much more real and much more human. She also gives a voice to the emotional side of coping. Living with Tourette's can mean facing embarrassment, anxiety, frustration, and the constant fear of being judged. And Rachel's openness helps others feel less alone in those experiences. At the same time, her content can help viewers who don't have Tourette's to become more thoughtful and compassionate. It encourages people to pause before staring, assuming, or making a joke, and to recognize that someone's tics are not the whole story as to who they are. In that way, Rachel's influence goes beyond awareness, it becomes advocacy. She helps shift the conversation from pity or ridicule toward understanding and respect. And for people living with Tourette's, that kind of representation can be incredibly meaningful. It sends a message that they don't have to hide, that their experience is valid, and that there is strength in being open about what life really looks like. Her work is a reminder that education is not just about information, it's also about empathy, visibility, and giving people the language to see each other more clearly. Now, my apologies to Rachel if I got her name wrong, and she deserves a huge salute. I mean, she is like one of my heroes for how she handles this. She deserves a salute for turning this into a strength to educate people and not letting it become something that defines her. Now, as we come to the end of this episode, I think the most important thing to remember about Tourette syndrome is that it is not a punchline. It's not a personality quirk, and it's not something that can be understood from a distance. It is a real neurological condition that affects real people in real ways, often in ways the outside world can't see. Behind every tick is a person navigating their life, their work, their school, their jobs, their relationships, the stress, the stigma, the everyday challenge of being misunderstood. What Tourette's teaches us is that compassion matters, patience matters, and listening before judging matters. When we replace stereotypes with understanding, we're making room for people to be seen more fully and treated more fairly. That shift might seem small, but for someone living with Tourette's, That can be huge. So if this episode leaves you with one takeaway, please let it be this: a person is always more than their symptoms. Tourette's may be part of someone's story, but it's never the whole story. And the more willing we are to see that, the more human we become. Now, that's all for this week. I hope you have a great week. This is Lee Perry. I am the Pirate Therapist, and I am signing off and wishing you all good sailing. We'll talk to you next week.